Welcome, Senator Coons.
Thank you, Sarah. Great to be on with you.
I want to first ask you about Zelensky's visit to Washington. This is a very dangerous trip for him to take in particular. Just leaving the country can be extremely nerve-wracking. Why do you think that he decided to leave Ukraine for the first time now and travel there to Washington?
I think this is an important opportunity for President Zelensky to speak to the American people. He's meeting with our president, with President Biden this afternoon, and he's speaking to the American Congress tonight. But who he's really speaking to through our representatives, through Congress and our president, is the American people. To thank us for another $45 billion in assistance that we will be appropriating in the end-of-year appropriations bill that we will hopefully pass tonight or tomorrow. He's thanking President Biden for what I believe will be the commitment of new state-of-the-art, sophisticated air defense systems. And he's going to remind us that the fight is far from over. Look, President Biden is just reaching the conclusion of what has been a remarkable first 2 years. Great legislation signed into law, nearly 100 federal judges confirmed, bipartisan successes. But I think where President Biden has been most successful on the world stage is pulling together our European allies, our global allies, in support of Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression and occupation. So I think it's timely. I think it's important. I recognize it's risky, but I am grateful that President Zelensky will be addressing us in person here in the United States Capitol tonight.
Senator Coons, you just mentioned the amount of money, $45 billion for Ukraine in the omnibus bill. Do you believe that America should be giving that amount of money in a time when the economy is sort of iffy? We're not sure where it's going to go, but there is a lot of concern, and it means a lot of money, a lot of weapons going to Ukraine from basically the American taxpayer. Do you think it's the right thing to do at this time?
Yes, absolutely. Whether or not Ukraine wins, whether they are successful in repelling the Russian invasion, is going to set the stage for this century. The appropriations bill that we are debating on the floor right now, that we'll vote on tonight or tomorrow, is going to spend more than $800 billion in the coming year on our defense. And frankly, nothing is more critical for our defense now than whether the West, whether our allies in Europe, whether the United States and our other allies from around the world successfully support Ukraine. The Ukrainians are doing the fighting and dying. They're not asking for a single American to go and fight on the front lines against the Russian invaders and occupiers of their country. They are asking for economic support, humanitarian support, and military support. And there has been broad and sustained bipartisan support for that, because members of the Senate of both parties recognize how urgent this is to push back Vladimir Putin's aggression and invasion. They first invaded and occupied Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, and the Ukrainians have been fighting this fight for 8 years. But this year, the Russians sent over 100,000 troops and tried to overrun the capital, to capture and kill Zelensky, to knock out his military, and to reoccupy Ukraine. This is a colonial war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, and one where the outcome is critical, not just for the United States, not just for the region, but for the world, and for whether or not autocracies are again going to be able to simply rule their region of the world through violence and aggression. So I think this is an investment well worth making. One last point, if I might, Sarah.
Sure.
Whether or not Vladimir Putin assesses that he can win, that he can renew his aggression and possibly overtake Ukraine, will depend on how reliable he thinks their support is. If we appropriate this significant amount of money tonight, it will be available to President Biden to give to Ukraine over the coming year. And some of the questions back and forth about whether or not there will be Republican support in the House in the coming Congress will recede, and Vladimir Putin will know that he is facing a well-armed, well-supported, and determined opposition in Ukraine.
Yeah, you certainly are sending, would send a message to Russia and to President Putin. I know that you visited Kyiv a few weeks ago. I had also been in there in 2014 and again after this unprovoked invasion. And there is a lot of heart and a lot of fight in the Ukrainian population. But you had the chance to sit down and meet with President Zelensky then. Can you give me a sense of what your takeaway was from him as a leader, but also on a personal level?
Look, going in to visit President Zelensky in person in Kyiv, as Republican Senator Rod Portman and I did in the first week of November, is a remarkable experience. It is a reminder that Vladimir Putin wants to kill no one in the world more than he wants to harm President Zelensky. You go into his offices through a Byzantine series of barriers and barbed wire. You're searched and examined several times. You go through long, dark tunnels underground and find your way to his offices in a path that I couldn't retrace if I wanted to. The security around him is intense. He and his family have chosen bravely to stay in Kyiv and fight. I'm sure you remember, but I hope your audience remembers, that in the very first days of the Russian invasion, the United States reached out to President Zelensky saying that we thought Kyiv might fall in a matter of days, and we offered him a ride out of Ukraine. He said, I don't need a ride, I need more ammunition. And he is determined to show in his person and by the risks that he's taken, as he did just earlier this week by going to the very front line to the town of Bakhmut, where there is bitter fighting in the eastern Donbass. His courage was reflected in our visit and our conversation. He was upbeat, he was optimistic, he was grateful for American support and for the Liberty Medal that Senator Portman and I delivered from the National Constitution Center.
I want to talk to you about someone who is extremely divisive, and I know we've all heard some pretty wacky things coming from her. But Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene called President Zelensky's America's shadow president, and there are some Republicans who seem to feel the same way. She said, of course, the shadow president has to come to Congress and explain why he needs billions of America's taxpayer dollars for the 51st state, Ukraine. This is absurd. Put America first. How do you respond to that?
Well, I don't spend a lot of my time responding to the most extreme voices in American politics. I invest most of my time in working across the aisle with serious legislators who want to contribute to moving our country forward. Obviously, President Zelensky is not our shadow president. He is the brave and determined leader of a free and democratic Ukraine, pushing back against aggression by Russia. And our duly elected president, Joe Biden, who is finishing up a great first 2 years as president, is inviting, welcoming, and meeting with President Zelensky. This is what democracies do. They support each other. And I can think of no accomplishment of President Biden of which I'm prouder on the world stage than his leadership in supporting President Zelensky and the brave Ukrainians who are fighting and dying on the battlefield. They are literally on the front lines of freedom globally.
Senator Coons, I want to move to another region. I would like to move to Afghanistan and what is happening there. When the Taliban first came in, the Taliban first took over Afghanistan and Kabul fell, they said they were sort of a kinder, gentler. That was the idea version of themselves. But Afghan's Taliban leaders now say that they are banning women from university education. Can you give me a sense of what you think the Taliban is really about? Do you think that they are trying to do things differently, or this is the same old Taliban that crushed women's rights back many decades ago?
Well, Sarah, anytime you talk about a government or a movement or an organization, it's important to recognize there's always factions. There were some Taliban leaders who'd been negotiating in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, who were outside of Afghanistan, who were trying to present a more moderate face to the world. And then there were the hard-eyed commanders on the ground who were carrying out atrocities. So as soon as the Taliban took over control of Afghanistan, we saw both of those factions. The government leadership of the Taliban announced that there would be no retribution, that they would try and reconcile with those who had been fighting alongside the Americans. But within a matter of hours, others, local Taliban commanders, were hunting down and in some cases killing those very Afghans who had stood shoulder to shoulder with us in our 20-year fight in Afghanistan. That's why I think it is so important for us to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, something Senator Klobuchar, Senator Graham, and I will be joining a bipartisan group of senators in talking about later here today on the floor of the Senate. We have heard from veterans from all over the United States who want to make sure that the more than 70,000 Afghans who fled the Taliban have legal status here in the United States. That's because I think it's the same old Taliban. I think once they've worked out their differences, their sort of brutal core, their repressive view of women, and their determination to exact revenge against those who worked with us in the war in Afghanistan has come to the fore, and that's why I think it's more important than ever that we vet every single Afghan who's come to the United States and give them a legal status here so they can begin to move forward with their lives here in the United States.
They've been through so much, decades of war there in Afghanistan. Senator Coons, I want to lastly ask you about an editorial that you wrote. We know that President Biden met with African nations this past week, talking about development aid to Africa. You wrote an editorial in the Huffington Post together with Prince Harry and a former Ethiopian prime minister calling for a better path forward for global environmental aid. And you proposed a conservation effort in Africa that is globally funded but locally led. Let me ask you about your idea. What does it mean in your estimation? What does that better path forward look like?
The better path forward for conservation that is African-led puts human development at the forefront of conservation. If non-Africans come to the continent and try to pour money into preserving or sustaining wildlife in national parks, and they ignore the legitimate needs of indigenous communities, they will not be successful. I've seen this play out over the last dozen years. My first 4 years here in the Senate, I chaired the Africa Subcommittee. I was an undergraduate student for a semester at the University of Nairobi decades ago. And I've had the blessing, the opportunity to see African-led solutions where heads of state, conservation leaders, communities find ways to promote the health and development and vibrancy of human communities that surround national parks and find a way in harmony that everyone can win, that we can preserve the biodiversity of some of the most majestic places on our planet and have human communities as stewards of these wild places benefit from the preservation of these wild spaces. It's also the most important thing we can do in the global fight for climate change. If we lose a place, for example, like the Congo River Basin, which is one of the most important tropical rainforests on the planet, it's irreplaceable. But the people of the Congo also have to have a path forward for their own thriving and their own sustainability. I went to Mozambique and to Rwanda in August with Prince Harry, with a wide range of folks from Congress, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, to look at two great examples. And I'm trying to move legislation here in the Senate with Senator Graham and a bipartisan group in the House and Senate that would create a public-private partnership that would follow up on the results of an African-led summit that happened in Rwanda this summer, calling for exactly this sort of outside partnership with African-led conservation.
We will be looking for that and paying attention. Senator Coons, I always appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas and your insights with us.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right, let's go ahead and focus more now on Afghanistan, where, as we've said, the Taliban has suspended university education for all female students. This video shows protest in front of one university in Jalalabad. The suspension is the latest step in the Taliban's brutal clampdown on the rights and freedoms of Afghan women. Girls are already barred